Thank you. I'm Sanjeev Goyal. I'm the chair of the economics faculty. I'd like to welcome you back to the Marshall Lectures 2017-18. This is the second lecture. Caroline Hoxby gave us the first lecture yesterday on taking productivity in education seriously. I thought it was a master class on how to take a very concrete first-order problem that we can all relate to and walk us through absolutely fascinating set of findings. And also, I thought many of us who are teachers, I thought I picked up many tips on how to lecture. Looking forward very much to the follow-up to the lecture. If you recall, there was a sort of, I think she used the word, there was a sort of disturbing aspect to the lecture yesterday that led us to think that there would be a lot of inequality in the way that you might want to optimally allocate resources, and that came out more or less from the standard Becker human capital model. So today, Caroline is going to take us sort of more deeply into the key sort of ingredient in the human capital model, the issue of ability or cognitive skills. And so I think I'd like to ask you all to join me in welcoming back Caroline Hoxby for the second lecture.
I'm so glad to be here again, and I thank you for the introduction and the warm welcome and visit that I've received. I've really been enjoying my visit to Cambridge. So today, we're going to be talking about a different type of productivity in education. I'm going to be talking specifically about the formation of cognitive skill or ability, and it's going to help us answer some of the questions that I think I left hanging at the end of my lecture yesterday. So let me just start by reminding you where I finished up yesterday. I came to the conclusion that people who begin higher education with much higher levels of cognitive skill seem to be able to absorb many more dollars of educational resources and yet use them with the same average productivity. So they appear to be able to absorb about an order of magnitude, about 10 times more dollars worth of educational resources in higher education, and still, each dollar has the same average productivity in terms of their lifetime value added. So that's quite a strong result. It was a surprising result to me, I have to say. It suggests that that what may be good for economic growth, in other words, having everyone make an optimal education investment, may be quite bad for income inequality, because some people who have high cognitive skill are going to end up with not just high cognitive skill, but also very high educational resource investments, and other people with low cognitive skill will end up at the opposite end of the distribution. So it's an important result, and it suggests that we ought to try to think seriously about where cognitive skill comes from. Now, if cognitive skills are fixed, or they are predetermined at birth. I mean two different things by that. By fixed, I mean literally your ability is fixed at birth and it just never changes. That's almost certainly that's not quite right. But it could be predetermined at birth. It could be that at birth your body's chemistry already knows where you're going in terms of cognitive skill, and you're set on some path, and it's going to get there regardless. That's what I'd call predetermined at birth. Then we're really in this bind. What's good for growth is bad for income inequality. But in the model of human capital that I was discussing yesterday, it's not a model in which there is any sense in which relative ability matters. There's any sort of rationing. There are no people who get to be able and other people who are not allowed to be able or anything like that. It's not like that. Human capital is capital. We don't think of ourselves saying, oh, physical capital, machines, no, there's only so much to go around. That's not the way it works. And human capital is the same. There's no particular reason why we couldn't all have high cognitive skill and all have high investments in human capital. Or at least I don't know of a model that suggests that off the top of my head. Okay, so understanding whether everyone could have high cognitive skill is important. I'm just going to remind you, I talked about this yesterday, but I'll remind you again, I'm going to use the words cognitive skill and ability somewhat interchangeably, and economists have generally been pretty loose and free with their use of a bunch of different types of words like cognitive skill, aptitude, ability, mental readiness, and so forth and so on, okay? I think on the whole, that's been a good thing because economists don't tend to be dogmatic about what cognitive skill or ability means, okay? And it turns out that that is somewhat justified by neuroscience. So neuroscientists argue that ability is not something that is fixed or predetermined, but is a plastic thing. It's multidimensional, so it's not just that I'm good at math or I'm good at languages or something else. It has many dimensions, okay, which include sort of social and emotional dimensions. It's modified by your experience, and in particular, it is improved by exercises that push your mind at the margin. And neuroscientists have in mind a very specific idea. What they're thinking of is you're taking on mental tasks that are just a little bit beyond your capacity, but not so much beyond your capacity that you don't know how to master them. So you're sort of stretching your mind all the time. It's like exercise. Okay, the bad thing about our sloppiness about word choice is that the initial model of human capital, Becker's model of human capital, did use the word ability, and people tended to assume that it was fixed because the word ability is often used to refer to fixed genetic ability outside of economics. Okay, so I'm just going to use ability and cognitive skill somewhat interchangeably, but I want to be clear on the idea that cognitive skill or ability really does mean some things and not everything, okay? So what does it mean? It is the type of higher order cognitive functioning in which your brain's frontal lobe plays a disproportionate role. Those are the tasks of reasoning, planning, integration of knowledge, and self-regulation. Okay, and I'm going to be talking quite a lot more about those types of skills, so I think you'll get a better idea of exactly what I mean. These capacities are intertwined with emotional and social skills, but they're also somewhat distinct, right? And they're very valuable in formal education. All right, this is just Becker's model of human capital formation. Just a reminder, your human capital, or think of it as, for instance, lifetime earnings or lifetime outcomes, are a function of schooling and ability. And yesterday, we discussed a lot this single crossing condition, which is the idea that the cross-partial derivative between schooling or educational resources and ability is positive in the Becker model. And that's a lot of what we did yesterday that got us to this idea that understanding ability or cognitive skill was a really important thing because it turns out to be very important for what happens in human capital. Okay, so as I mentioned yesterday, Becker did not really write down this model with ability in it because he knew a lot about neuroscience. It really wasn't a field at the time when he wrote this down. Rather, it was because he just observed in practice that people who seem to have higher ability or cognitive skills seem to get a lot more education, and so the model had to do something to match the data. So that suggests that we ought not to, on the basis of the model alone, take this idea that ability is fixed as a serious thing. We ought to investigate it or explore it. Maybe ability should, in fact, be a function of a person's previous educational experiences. So maybe if I learned a lot in the past, my ability has actually been improving and changing and so forth, in which case having human capital be a function of schooling and ability isn't quite right. Ability at any given time should be sort of a function of my schooling history. And in this lecture, that's what we're going to be interested in, and whether ability is plastic and so on. Okay, so let me tell you about the 4 steps that we're going to try to get through in today's lecture. The first one is a review of recent neuroscience evidence, okay, which is going to suggest that ability is plastic, particularly in early adolescence. So early adolescence is for girls, sorry men, but females start earlier. Okay, girls start at about 10.5 on average and go up to about 13.5 or 14, and boys start at about 11.5 on average about a year later and end about a year later as well. That's early I Okay, so I'm just going to review that neuroscience research. I I do not claim to be a neuroscientist. I have not done any experiments. I have not dissected any brains. So this will be purely about my trying to tell you what the neuroscientists know. And we don't need to get too much into the details because we're just economists after all. All we really need to know is what is predicted by the neuroscience. Then I'm going to give you some descriptive evidence, and I'm going to show that it supports the hypothesis that early adolescence is this important time both of change in a person's frontal lobe, okay, where the cognitive, higher order cognitive skills develop, and also when ability is changing then, and the changes have long-lasting effects. And that's I'll show you that that's quite important for logical reasons. Then I'm going to try to show you some causal evidence that educational interventions that succeed tend to have disproportionately great effects on early adolescence, and when they do have effects, they tend to be unusually long-lasting. And then finally, I will show you that we invest the fewest educational resources or instructional resources in early adolescence right now, which is probably unintentional, but is not a good idea if, in fact, educational resources are especially productive during those years. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the intellectual history of the relationship between neuroscience and people thinking about education production. I'm certainly not the first person to think that neuroscience ought to motivate us to think about education a little bit differently. I could argue, in fact, I would argue, that probably the entire early childhood education I have to call it an industry or maybe a religion or something like that. Anyway, it's big, okay, was motivated by neuroscientific arguments. It's often associated with James Heckman, but he is by no means the only person who is associated with this literature at this point. It is a very vast area of research. There were three basic arguments, and I agree with all three of the arguments, to be clear. The first one is the idea that ability is plastic or changeable at certain ages. The second one is that at certain ages, the abilities that you develop create path dependence, or they create a trajectory on which you get relatively stuck from then on. Okay, that's also important, because if it changed my ability, but then later on it just changed right back, wouldn't make much of a difference. If it changes my ability, and then after that it has a long-lasting influence on me, of course that's more important. And then the third is the idea that the ability at these ages is not just changeable, but it is susceptible to educational interventions. Okay, so it's not just that it could change for reasons we don't control, but we can also have some policies that might be able to affect it in a good way. Okay, so where do I think the early childhood research went right and went wrong? Early childhood, that's basically gestational age of about 36 weeks, up to age 3, 3.5, something like that, is a period of enormous brain plasticity, and the effects of what happens in your brain during that period of time are very long-lasting. So it's done, fellows. Okay, and however, the brain areas that are affected are essentially the sensory lobes in the back of your brain, and those lobes control things like vision, hearing, your sense of space, speech recognition, developing kind of bonding with your parents, all kinds of things like that. Your frontal lobe, though, is not actually, not much wiring is going on in your frontal lobe during this early period of time. And your frontal lobe is the area that controls higher order cognitive skills, or controls the cognition things that we talked about earlier: reasoning, integration, self-control, things like that, okay? Moreover, the successful interventions that seem to suit early childhood and that have been shown to have an effect are not really primarily educative in nature. So for instance, breastfeeding or better nutrition for babies, not exposing them to pollution, having better parental nurturing, these may all be very good things, but it's not obvious that you want to send a child to school to get these types of interventions. So what I think happened in this literature was that at first everyone thought, well, we'll do these things in early childhood, and then we'll see children's test scores rise in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. Following this logic that I just talked about, the evidence really is not strong that that happens, okay? The evidence is, fairly strong that if I do these nice things for very small children, it has good effects on them, but it doesn't seem to be largely about education, and it doesn't seem to affect their cognition in the way that we expected it to affect their cognition. And yet the policy prescription remained early childhood education. And I think that's kind of a slippery slope. You started one argument and you ended up with another argument, and you kept the same policy prescription. That doesn't, to me, that's a problem. All right. Okay, so now we're going on to part one. What does recent neuroscience say? It identifies adolescence as the period when higher order cognitive skills are developed in your brain. I'm going to read you a bunch of quotations from neuroscientists just so that you get a sense of what they assert. Some of them are going to sound like they already know that the things that I'm going to show you empirically are true. We're going to treat it as a hypothesis, okay? And I will come back to this later and explain sort of what I think they actually know and what they don't quite know, and I'll try to be very clear about that, because neuroscience doesn't really provide the causal evidence we need, but I'm going to try to provide some of it today. Okay, so what does recent neuroscience say? Well, it says basically that when you can scan someone's brain a lot now. Okay, so it used to be the case 25 years ago, 30 years ago, that they would wait until someone knocked you down with a motor car, and then they would dissect your brain and find out what it looked like at various ages. And you can see that you would learn something, but there are only so many people knocked down each day, so you only get so many brains, and so you don't learn all that much very quickly. And also what they were restricted to doing was essentially looking at the brain more from the outside. But today, magnetic resonance imaging of the brain is, you can do it a lot, and it's very cheap, and so they have, well, cheap compared to the past, and so they have studies of thousands and thousands of persons' brains where they follow the person over time and have the person do many MRIs, and they can follow what's going on inside your brain. They're not really looking at it from the outside, they're looking at the wiring, and they can see how the wiring is changing inside, so that the state-of-the-art knowledge has really changed a lot. I'm going to borrow from a bunch of articles and review articles that I've cited here. For those of you who are undergraduates or students, you can get copies of these slides, and then you'll know from where I am quoting. Okay, so what is it that happens when our brain is developing? What is brain plasticity about? It's about two things. The first is called synaptic pruning, like pruning a tree or a shrub or something like that. And the second is called myelination. So here's how I want you to think about what happens in pruning. Your brain first lays down a whole bunch of neurons and a whole bunch of synapses between the neurons. They're like little connectors. And it is exuberant. That is the word they use for it in neuroscience. It just sort of puts them out all over the place. Think about filling up your house with wiring. You just put wires everywhere. Okay, just fill up all the rooms and lay them down on the floors and everything else. Now, once you've filled up your house with all of these wires, they're not really connected to anything else. They're just, you have wires all over the place. And after a while, you start saying, well, I should really connect this wire to this wire, or I should really connect this television to this electrical outlet. And you start using certain connections a lot, and you start not using other connections at all. And you start throwing out the wires that you really don't need and building up the ones that you really do need. That is synaptic pruning. It is essentially a process that makes your brain function more effectively, the way that thinning a tree allows the remaining branches to grow stronger. Now, myelination is another type of process, and essentially it's your brain wrapping white matter around the connections that it's using a lot in order to speed electrical impulses between the neurons that are in those circuits. Okay, so think of it as, I used to have these wires lying all over my house. Now I've decided I ought to wrap some of them in that rubbery stuff, okay, so they don't shock one another. and I don't get shocked by my wires, that's myelination, okay? And it makes the electrical impulses more efficient, but it also makes each circuit that gets myelinated more durable or hardened. In the words of neuroscientists, it's a hardened connection. So then after that, it can still change. You know, you can actually keep, your brain is plastic pretty much right up until the time that you die, so you can keep changing your brain, but it becomes harder to change your brain because you've got more of these durable circuits already laid down in your brain. Okay, so those are the two processes, pruning and then myelination. And you can see how they fulfill the conditions for disproportionate influence that we talked about with early childhood education. The first is that pruning makes your brain elastic. It's not putting out all the wires that makes your brain elastic, it's pruning them down. And secondly, myelination makes the changes that occur more durable or more long-lasting. Okay, so that's the basic logic of it. There are two periods of unusual pruning and myelination. The first is early childhood, basically ages 0 to 3, and the second one is early adolescence. And I've already told you when that happens. Early childhood, I've told you what happens then. So it's the back lobes of your brain that are largely being pruned and myelinated. And then in early adolescence, the frontal lobe of your brain. I like this quote. The childhood development period from birth to about age 10 focuses on learning how to be a human being, learning to move, to communicate, to master basic cultural knowledge and social skills. The adolescent developmental period focuses on learning how to be a productive human being. So that is when you're going to master higher order cognitive skills. All right, just a few more quotes to give you a sense of what neuroscientists say. Until recently, it was believed that no period of development came close to the early years in terms of the potential impact of experience on the brain. Because the brain approaches its ultimate adult size by the age of 10 or so, many had assumed that brain development was more or less complete before adolescence began. We now know, however, that internal transformations in the brain's anatomy and activity are not always reflected in the organ's outward appearance. Adolescence is a period of brain growth that is far more sensitive to experience than anyone previously imagined. This is just a visual showing you what a newborn's brain, that's 36 weeks of gestation, a newborn's brain, then 3 months, then 6 months, then 2 years. At 2 years, in the back lobes of your brain, you have all the neurons that you are ever going to need. And at this point, you start pruning, and by 4 years, you've sort of pruned up your brain. You can see that we've thrown out some synapses and neurons. And by 6 years, it's pretty fully pruned, and you're just myelinating for a while, okay? Putting those cords around your electrical connections. Between the ages of 6 and 10, you do more myelination. Towards the end of this period, your brain starts to engage again in a lot of creation of neurons and synapses, but in the frontal lobe. And then frontal lobe pruning begins, and I said about 10.5 on average for females, 11.5 for males. And you can see that between 6 years and 14 years, again, your brain is pruning out a lot of synapses, okay? And then after that, you are going to continue to do some pruning and myelination for the rest of your life, but the rate of change is going to slow down a tremendous amount, okay? So that's the basic idea of the neuroscience. Let me skip that. Okay, this is just asserting that it's not just brain malleability in the first few years. I think the quote that I like here is whether the brain is as plastic in adolescence as it is early in life isn't really the right question, because the brain is plastic in different places during these two periods. It's plastic back here first, and then it's plastic up here. Okay. It's also the case that plasticity sort of is both potentially good and bad. And if you're a parent, you may have noticed this about your adolescent. If you remember being an adolescent, you can perhaps recall being an adolescent is tough. Why? Because the fact that you are so plastic during this period both means that things can turn out very well if you have the right experiences potentially, but also it's a time of relatively high risk because things can turn out rather badly. So all that plasticity sort of, as neuroscientists say, cuts both ways. And this quote really points out to you that unlike the sensory lobe development, which is largely pre-programmed by biology, your frontal lobe development is not, and that's because it's not really required in every society. So it's not obvious that everyone really needs to do algebra in the world, right? There were a lot of primitive societies where algebra was probably not required, all right? And therefore, it's not pre-programmed into you. And that's why there's so much variation in how well different people reason, plan for the future, and control their emotions, but far less variation in how well people see, hear, or walk. Okay, so it's not pre-programmed. They think experience is important. And then finally, adolescence is your last major period of plasticity. So although you can keep changing your brain after this, it's going to become harder to do. You're going to have to work harder to achieve the same changes that you achieve in adolescence. Okay, so that's kind of the neuroscience. I hope I've given you all a sense of what it's like. Now let's look at some evidence. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you some descriptive evidence of two types. First, I'm going to show you that cognitive skill trajectories diverge, especially in early adolescence. And secondly, I'm going to show you that after early adolescence, cognitive skill trajectories seem to harden up. In other words, students are going to switch what trajectory they're on a lot less often. Right? So this is just descriptive evidence. It's not causal evidence. I'm using a bunch of longitudinal data to create these trajectories, and also data from a major US state. It's administrative data on students. All of the data are in what are called IRT-based vertical scales. You don't need to know what that means. It just means that you should trust the idea that some psychometrician out there, those are the people who are from psychology who do statistics, especially for education, some psychometrician out there believes that they're measuring absolute cognitive skill well. I'm going to mostly show you things from math because it's a little more tightly related to cognitive skill development in your frontal lobe, but the pictures for reading are really not very different. That's why I'm not showing you both sets of pictures, because you'd be bored having to switch back and forth between math and reading all the time. Okay? If you're interested, though, I will send them to you. Okay, so let's look at, we're going to see a lot of figures like this, and I'm going to show them quite rapidly. In each figure, I'm showing you an age at the right hand, which is sort of the age, the furthest age that you're going to achieve on the graph, and then age at the left hand, which is an earlier age. So here I'm looking at children who are 0.75 years, or 9 months, and they're females, up to age 2, and I'm looking at their mental, this is a test of mental acuity that they take at 9 months, and another test at 2 years. And each one of these lines is a trajectory associated with one of the deciles. And the deciles are always picked based on the age at the right-hand side. So in other words, it's saying, given the decile where I end up at age 2, where did I begin at 9 months? So if I want to trace myself, you know where you are now, perhaps in some cognitive skill world. Okay? You want to trace back, you think of tracing back to yourself as a 9-month-old. Okay? That's kind of, we're in that exercise. All right. So what you can see is that female mental acuity seems to converge between 9 months and 2 years of age. Okay, it's that the trajectories are tightening up. Children are becoming more alike in mental acuity, and so do males. Okay? The same thing basically happens from age 3 to 5, although there's less action from age 3 to 5, but you can see that there's mild convergence for females in these mental trajectories. This is now math scores. And also for males. Mild convergence between ages 3 and 5. Now, after age 5, things start to change. You will see, first of all, that math scores start to rise. That's, children are learning math in school, thank goodness. Their math scores tend to rise, but they're also starting to diverge. And you'll notice that there is particularly a lot of divergence between ages 10 and a half and 13 and a half. I'm going to do a close-up on those ages in just a moment. But there, you can see that the trajectories start to fan out, so that the children on the high the females on the high trajectories really end up quite a bit different than the females on the lowest trajectory. Okay, and although this is also interesting, you can see that these trajectories are not crossing a great deal. That's already a sign that there is some amount of persistence in which trajectory you're on, but I'm going to show you better data on that in a moment, because these are just the averages for different trajectories. So that was females. That's males, which still is diverging, fanning out quite a bit, but doesn't really look all that similar to females. I'm not enough of a neuroscientist to know quite why. But anyway, this is how the males look. You can see they're fanning out. Now let's look close up at this sort of these interesting ages between about 8.5 and about 13.5. So here's data on every year for females between 8.5 and 13.5. So this is grade 3 basically at the bottom, and this is grade 8 at the top. Okay, if that's helpful to you. So you'll notice that what happens is there's actually still a little bit of narrowing. By the way, I've thrown out the middle trajectories just to make it more obvious what's going on. So what you can see is there's just a little bit of narrowing between ages 8.5 and 10.5. And then after that, the top trajectories tend to fan out from the bottom trajectories. Okay? And it's similar for males, except the fanning out starts about 1 year later, which is what we would expect. So boys start diverging from one another just a little bit later than girls do in this crucial period of early adolescence. And then from ages 13.5 to 17.5, not very much happens. The trajectories all sort of stay on course with one another. Everyone's doing a little bit better in math, but there's no real convergence or divergence going on for females or for males. Okay, so summing up, students' cognitive skills converge from about age 1 to 5, from ages 5 to 13.5. Skills diverge. The close-up evidence suggests that the divergence accelerates at age 10.5 for females and about age 11.5 for males. And from 13.5 to 17.5, your cognitive skills neither converge nor diverge. Okay? All right, so that's the idea of the trajectories. I showed you that they diverge in adolescence, but what I have not shown you is that they harden up or they become durable so that the trajectory that you're on is a good predictor of where you're going to be in the future. And in order to show you evidence on whether this is happening, what I'm going to show you is some decile to decile transition matrices, where I'm going to place each student in his or her current decile based on his or her current scores. All right, so let me explain what I mean by this. Let's say that I am in the 5th decile on math scores as a 5-year-old, and I want to see where I'm going to end up as a 7-year-old. If I'm in the 5th decile again, I would be on the diagonal of a transition matrix. I started in the 5th decile, I end up in the 5th decile, right? If I started in the 5th decile and I end up in the 10th decile, I've actually moved quite far away. Right? I started on one trajectory, I end up on quite a different trajectory between ages 5 and 7, so I've made a big transition. Or I might make a small transition. I was in the 5th decile, I end up in the 4th decile or the 6th decile. Okay? So I'm going to show you transition matrices, and they're going to be of this form. Mental skill or math skill at one age is going to be in the rows, and then mental skills 2 years later are going to be the columns. Now, if everyone were equally likely to be in any decile at any point in time, in other words, it was just random where you ended up at each age, then what we would see was that each one of these boxes would have the number 10 in it, or approximately 10 in it, okay? Because we would be 10% likely to end up in any decile regardless of where we started. Okay, so does that make sense? Okay. All right, so what I've done is, I don't count on you to read all those numbers, which would be a bit of a bore, but instead, the light pink ones tell you that it's slightly under 10%. If you see a box that is actually white, it means that it's basically 0. And if it's above 10%, it's a darker pink. But you can see that a lot of these numbers are pretty close to 10, okay? Showing you that, in fact, from ages 1 to age 3, the decile at which you started doesn't really have that much of an effect on the decile at which you end up at age 3. You could be moving from 2 to 6 or 7 to 2 or whatever, okay? All right. Now let's look at this. These are females. The male one looks just alike, so I'm not sure going to show you the male one. All right, so here are females from ages 11 to 13, and you can see that their trajectories are starting to harden up during early adolescence because we see much more activity on the diagonal. So for instance, if we look at students, female students who are in the 10th decile at age 11 and a half, the vast majority of them end up in the 9th or 10th decile at age 13 and a half, okay? None of them end up in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th deciles, basically. The vast majority of them end up at the top again. If you started in one of the bottom deciles at age 11 and a half, you're very likely to still be in one of the bottom deciles at age 13 and a half. So you can see there's just very little action off the diagonals, right? Everything is starting to push towards the diagonal. The same thing is true of boys from age 11 to 13. Again, most of the action is now closer to the diagonal. And if we roll it forward just a little bit, ages 15 to 17, we can see even more of the action is on the diagonal. In fact, people are now really very likely to stay in the same decile that they were at age 15 when we observed them at age 17, especially if they were in one of the uppermost deciles or one of the lowest deciles. The middle deciles are always the most flexible. I don't know what that's about, really. But it's sort of telling you that the two tails, if you're in the bottom decile or you're in the top decile, you're probably going to stay there, okay? So these trajectories are really hardening up. Okay, so that's the evidence that I wanted to show you, and it is compatible, it's consistent. Oh, sorry, those are the boys. They harden up even a little bit more than the girls do, or become more durable. Okay, it's just an extra slide. Okay, so after diverging in early adolescence, it does look like students' trajectories harden. This is consistent with the neuroscience evidence. But let me be perfectly clear, this is not causal evidence that we can affect a child's ability or cognitive skills by giving them exogenous interventions, in early adolescence. And I think this is where neuroscientists make a bit of a mistake. To notice that someone's brain is changing and to see that it appears to be plastic and moving around with what's going on doesn't actually mean for sure that it is not pre-programmed. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you were just pre-programmed to have a high level of cognitive skill in something like math, okay? So whenever you reached early adolescence, you were going to really get interested in math and really love math and start building all kinds of math cognitive skills in your brain. The fact that you join the chess club could be endogenous to the pre-programming. So I could say, oh, it looks like because you joined the chess club or because you joined the math club or because you like to do mathematical things or something, that's why your brain was wiring up that way. No, it could be that you were pre-programmed to like math and that's why you joined the math club. Okay, so we have to be careful because we care about causality. We care about whether the educational interventions can actually change you, not just whether you seek out experiences that might be suitable for your type of brain. Okay, does everyone see the distinction between the two? Okay, so now I've got to move on from this descriptive evidence to something that's more like causal evidence, plausibly causal evidence on whether early adolescents are especially affected by interventions. And this was tough. I need interventions that fulfilled these 4 criteria, and I could only think of 2. And I really gave it a lot of thought, so this was the best I could do. I need interventions that are grade or age specific. So I need to be able to say, the child is getting this at age 6, at age 9, at age 12, whatever. Right? It can't be something that you sort of have all the time or you have periodically or something like that. It needs to be age or grade specific. It needs to be an intervention that could plausibly be applied at any grade. So it can't be something like a special curriculum in reading that's designed to develop certain types of high-level reading skills. Well, because you couldn't give that to a 2nd grader, right? That's not plausible that curriculum could work on a 2nd grader, okay? The intervention has to have usually statistically significant effects because testing whether an intervention works better on early adolescence, when it doesn't really work much on anyone, is not going to be informative. And finally, I want to be able to test for long-lasting effects. So these 4 criteria actually end up being quite demanding, and I could only think of 2 interventions that fit all of these criteria at once. The first is having a teacher who has high value added versus low value added, and the second is attending a charter school. So I'm going to talk you through the evidence on both of these interventions and whether it looks like early adolescents are disproportionately affected and whether the effects have especially long-lasting trails. Okay, teachers' value added. So, you know, if anyone asks you on the street, what is the one thing you know works to improve educational outcomes, most good economists of education, if they were being sensible, would tell you better teachers. Okay, that's actually, we sort of know that at this point. Having a better teacher is better, and it makes a big difference, and that's maybe the only thing that almost everybody agrees about. How do we know this? Interestingly enough, I have to say we didn't know this 15 years ago. I can remember I was teaching my graduate class, and a student of mine, his name is Jonah Brokoff, he's a professor now at Columbia, very glorious. But I said to him, oh, wouldn't it be neat if we could measure teachers' value added by getting all this sort of data from a school district? And he called up his home school district in the state of New Jersey, and he wrote the first really serious modern teachers' value added paper, which is just amazing to me because there's this now vast literature that computes teachers' value added. The empirical methods that we use have become more sophisticated over time. They mimic random assignment of students to teachers. And the notion of teachers' value added is very simple. We have Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Smith. They both teach 3rd grade in the same school. If we randomly assign them students year after year after year, over time we will figure out which one of those 2 3rd grade teachers is the better teacher because one of them will raise students' achievement or students' other outcomes more than the other one does. And it turns out that when we do this exercise, we get very consistent results, which is that teachers matter a lot, that teachers differ a lot even within school in terms of how much they affect students' academic progress, and that teachers' value added can also be computed on a bunch of other outcomes, not just test scores, but discipline, educational attainment, earnings, you've got it. And in fact, teachers who tend to raise student scores, 3rd grade, 4th grade teachers, whatever, also you can show that the students have higher earnings later, and it seems to be related to how much the teacher raised their academic progress. So it's a vast literature at this point. Okay, so how does the value-added exercise proceed? I'm doing something fairly standard. I'm going to estimate each teacher's value-added based on all the classes the teacher ever taught, except the classes she taught in the year in which she was teaching the student in question. And I have student level data and teacher data for a whole state, so I have all the teachers, all the students for several years, okay? So I do that. That's how I estimated teachers' value added. I put the teachers' value added into standard deviations units, and I do the same thing with students' math scores or reading scores. That's just to make it easier to interpret, okay? And then I regress each student's achievement on his or her teacher's value added. And this is going to be able to help us answer questions like the following. If as a 6th grader, I get a teacher whose value added is 1 standard deviation higher, is that going to raise my scores more than if I had had a teacher whose value added was 1 standard deviation higher when I was a 3rd grader? Or would it have been better to get a teacher with higher value added when I was an 8th grader or a 10th grader or whatever, okay? So that's the basic idea. I'm going to be able to estimate those, and they're going to be grade specific. All right, I've given you all the detail about how I do the value added calculations here for those of you who are going to get the slides. I'm not going to run through it, but actually, apart from needing to get all the data, it's quite easy to do this, so I invite you all to estimate teacher value added for yourself, and you too will find, I'm sure, that teachers vary a lot in their value added. Okay. All right, so this is the effect of a better teacher on females' math scores in grades 3 through 8. Everything is in standard deviation units. So this is the estimated effect of a teacher whose value added is 1 standard deviation higher, which is really quite a big difference between teachers, okay? That's not a trivial difference between teachers. And you can see that the effects are kind of small when you're in the 3rd grade, a little higher when you're in the 4th grade. They peak when the girl is in the 5th or 6th grade. And then they're also pretty high in the 7th and 8th grade, and after that, they're lower again, okay? So early adolescence seems like the time when it's most valuable to have an unusually good teacher for a girl. Here's the chart for boys. You can see, again, there's this quite sharp peak in grades 5 and 6, okay? And then for boys in grades 7, 8, and 9, having an especially good teacher is especially good for developing higher math scores. Mm-hmm.
Can you translate grade to ages?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So 3rd grade is about 8, 8.5 on average. 4th grade is 9.5. 5th grade is 10.5, and so on. 8th grade is 13.5, okay? And so on. On average, people are 17.5 in grade 12. Okay? All right, thank you. All right, so having a teacher with high value added matters most for early adolescence. That's grades 5 to 10 for females or 5 to 9 for males. So for females, it's sort of ages 10 to 13 seem like they're especially affected, and for males, it's like 10 to 14, okay? So that's sort of what the neuroscience led us to expect. But we might ask, is this effect, okay, it's disproportionate, but is it long-lasting, or does it just disappear? So the way that people try to compute long-lastingness of teacher effects is what they do is they compute each teacher's effect 2 years on, 3 years on, 4 years on. You can actually do this in a fairly elaborate way. I'm not going to go through all the details. But the idea is, what if I had a really good teacher in the 3rd grade? How much of that is still left when I'm in the 5th grade? I've now had a 4th grade teacher, and I have a new 5th grade teacher. Is there any remains of having a good 3rd grade teacher? Well, we can actually do that sort of a calculation because we have to estimate the value added of all your teachers and then regress your achievement on them, all of the value addeds simultaneously, but it's a totally feasible exercise. And what we do is we look at the ratio of the years-on effect to the contemporaneous effect. For instance, I might say the 2 years-on effect of my 3rd grade teacher is 40% of her contemporaneous effect on me. So maybe she raised my achievement by 0.3 of a standard deviation when I was in the 3rd grade, and in the 5th grade, I'm still hanging on to about 40% of that, okay? So this tells us how long-lasting it is. The estimates suggest that early adolescence teachers' effects last longer. So what I want to direct you to are grades 5 and 6, where you remember that the effects were biggest. This is not showing you again that the effects are biggest. It's showing you that those big effects were not only big, but they are the most long-lasting. Okay? 2 years later, females and males are still hanging on to about 40% of those effects, whereas the effects in other grades stay with us a little less. Okay? All right, so that suggests that teachers' effects are not just bigger in early adolescence, but they also stay around longer. All right, so that's all I'm going to tell you about teachers' effects. I'm now going to switch to talking about charter schools. What are charter schools? They're a lot like academies schools in England. Okay? They're public schools or state schools, but they are autonomous. In the United States, most of them are startup schools. In other words, they're not conversions of existing state schools, which makes them a bit different than the academy schools. They're usually startups, and they're almost exclusively in poor areas or racial minority areas. Charter schools admit students on a strict lottery basis, so you apply, but the application isn't really an application. It's like filling in a postcard and writing down your name and address type of thing. And then they just pull these cards from a hat, or they do, nowadays they do computerized lotteries, of course. Because these schools very disproportionately serve disadvantaged students, it's very important to use the lotteries as a way of evaluating the schools. We can't just compare charter school students to students who don't attend charter schools, because on the whole, the charter school students are much more disadvantaged than students who don't attend charter schools. So instead, we use the lotteries so that we can do a sort of apples to apples comparison of only the children who wanted to apply to the charter school. Some of them get lotteried in, some of them are lotteried out and remain in the regular public schools, and that's how we do an evaluation of a charter school, is to compare the trajectories of those children over time, the children who were lotteried in and the children who were lotteried out. It's a randomized control trial, basically. Okay, so there are numerous lottery-based studies of charter schools at this point. Some of them are big, some of them are small. I've conducted some of the bigger ones on New York City and Chicago. Joshua Angrist at MIT and his co-authors have done a lot of work on Boston. There's some work on Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and so it's not a small literature at this point either. Not all charter schools have the same effects, so the effects on average are always positive in lottery-based studies, but that doesn't mean they're all the same. So you can see there's a range here. Actually, New York City, which I'm going to use for a reason I'll explain, is kind of on the low side of the average effects, towards the bottom of those ranges that I'm showing you here. In math, 0.08 to 0.4 of a standard deviation. In reading, 0.05 to 0.3 of a standard deviation, okay? So I know that standard deviations, you know, they don't mean that much to people outside the economics of education, but generally if an education intervention raises your test scores by 0.1 of a standard deviation, that's considered a successful intervention, okay? So the notion that you're going to move kids from the very bottom of the distribution to the very top, which would be about a whole standard deviation, just doesn't happen for very many education interventions. Okay, so about 1/10 of a standard deviation is considered good. All right, so how do we get estimates out of a lottery? Well, we use an instrumental variables method. It's pretty straightforward. We're going to estimate a treatment on the treated effect, okay, because not everyone who's lotteried in is going to actually attend a charter school, although the vast majority of them do. So in the first stage, we use a student's lotteried-in indicator, so that's just a 0-1 indicator for whether you won the lottery or not, times the number of years since his lottery, and that will be the intended years, the years that we intended you to be in charter school if you had complied with the lottery, okay? And that's an instrument for your actual years of treatment. So here I'm regressing the student's years in the charter school on a constant, plus this interaction between the dummy for being lotteried in, the year since the lottery, and then there is a whole set of fixed effects for being in each and every lottery. What is that doing? A whole set of indicator variables. I was in the lottery for the Thomas Jefferson School for the 3rd grade and da-da-da year, that's what I mean, okay? That's a fixed effect for that. That vector of fixed effects, it assures us that the control for each treated student is another child who was lotteried out and who participated in exactly the same lottery in the same year for the same school in the same grade, okay? So that's all that that's doing. The second stage of the instrumental variable, I regress the student's score on how many years he or she has been in the charter school, and that's going to be instrumented by this first stage equation, okay? So I hope those of you who've learned instrumental variables, that makes sense, okay? Trust me if not. It's a treated on the treated effect. I'm going to look at New York City's charter schools. I don't know if you know the boroughs of New York very well, the map, but if you do, you will see that they're all clustered in these poor areas like Harlem and the South Bronx, okay? Why do I look at the New York City charter schools since I've studied other charter schools as well? Well, it's because they have various intake grades. So some of the charter schools in New York City basically take in everybody in kindergarten, and then they keep them for grades K, kindergarten through 4th grade. Some of the charter schools start in grades 5 or 6, and they have a middle school. 5 is more common. So they usually have grades 5 through 8, 4 grades that are middle school grades. And then the rest of the students start at charter schools that start in grade 9, and they have high school grades of grades 9 through 12 in the United States. So in other words, some children are being taken in to charter schools when they're age 5. Some of them are being taken in when they're age 10. Those are the ones who start in grade 5. And some of them are being taken in when they are about 14, 14 and a half. Those are the ones who start in grade 9. Is everyone happy with the notion? Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to compare the effect of a year of charter school for students who begin at age 5 versus age 10 or age 14. Okay, and we know that it's the ones who start in middle school who are sort of the early adolescents when they get this dose of charter school. And this is what it looks like. So the difference between the orange bars and the blue bars is not very important. It's a per year of charter school effect. In the orange bars, I've limited it just to the first 4 years, so that in each case we're comparing sort of 4 years of getting charter school, but you can see there's not much of a difference. Okay, so, I'm sorry, I should have said this is for, no, it's both females and males, and it's math scores. And you can see that being in a charter school, starting in a charter school at kindergarten, it does have a positive effect. I mean, these are statistically significant effects, but it's quite small compared to the effect if I start in charter school in grade 5 at about age 10, and that's also better than starting at about age 14 and a half in grade 9. Now, actually, to be honest, I knew about this when I did the charter school study. You can read my charter school study, it's online. You know, I never actually mentioned this in the charter school study. Why? Because it puzzled me, and I really didn't have an explanation. I really didn't know what to do with it, because having come from this world in which everyone said to me that early childhood education was better, I had assumed that the children who entered in kindergarten would have a bigger charter school effect than the children who entered in grade 5, and I really just didn't know what to do with this information. So it sort of sat in the back of my head bothering me for almost a decade. Okay, that's how long it takes me to puzzle things out. Okay, so that's the effect on math scores. Here's the effect on reading scores. And you can see that, like math scores, the biggest effects are for those who get the dose of charter school when they're in middle school grades or in early adolescence. So the effects are biggest for early adolescence, but are they long-lasting? Well, the best way to try and test that for charter schools is to look at some long-term outcomes. So what I looked at was essentially whether they go on to college, which I'm calling post-secondary education attainment here. These students are fairly young still, so it's just really whether they went on to college or not. We don't know whether they went to graduate school or anything like that. Okay, per year of charter school, these are all statistically significant effects, but the effect is quite small. For students who started in charter school in kindergarten, the effect is very large, 0.2 of a standard deviation on going to college for students who started charter school in grade 5, and then it's smaller but still pretty substantial for students who start in charter school at grade 9. Again, suggesting that it isn't just that the effect on the children who started at about age 10 is bigger, but it also shows up even more in long-term outcomes. All right, so I'm almost done. Because we've gone through all of the interesting causal evidence at this point. I have one more point I want to make before I conclude, and that is that early adolescents are actually, I don't mean to say they're absolutely deprived of educational resources, but they are relatively deprived of educational resources compared to students of other ages and other grades. Now, why is this? I don't think it's some sort of a bias against early adolescents, but it's a kind of inevitable outcome of the way in which schooling is organized and the way in which we think about priorities in education now. So there are very small class sizes now or relatively small class sizes now in early grades and many developed economies. Why? Because the emphasis on early childhood education has made us think, well, we really need to put kindergartners in small classes and first graders in small classes and so forth. These 5- and 6-year-olds should be in very small classes. So that means they're more expensive because there are fewer of them per teacher, okay? All right, so that explains why the little kids are more expensive than the kids who are in middle school grades, like 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? For students who are in the high school grades, the reason why they are more expensive is twofold. First, they're in specialized classes, so you're taking advanced physics or you're taking calculus or something like that, so you need to have more specialized classes. You're taking third-year Latin. Okay, all those specialized classes mean you've got to have a lot of teachers, and you're probably in smaller classes to take those specialized or expert classes. Furthermore, the sorts of teachers who end up teaching those classes tend to be teachers with more seniority in most developed economies, so they get paid more. As most developed economies pay teachers pretty much on the basis of their educational degrees and how much seniority they have in the system. And then the third thing is that high seniority teachers, one of the things you can do if you're a high seniority teacher is not you just get paid more, but you usually have more pick of what a teaching assignment you're going to have. It turns out that people don't like to teach early adolescents. Okay, so as soon as they get an opportunity to move away from teaching the 6th and 7th graders, they do. They may be having a bigger effect on them. Maybe they don't realize that, but they may have been having a big effect on them, but they don't want to teach them. And the fact is that all that nice stuff about the plasticity of early adolescence, you know, that you can change them more, also means that they're sort of a pain in the neck, okay? And so people move away from teaching them. This is the result that if you look at instructional spending by grade, where I've normalized grade 9 to be 1, just so that we're looking relative to grade 9, you can see that in these early grades, spending is higher than it is in the middle school grades. And then spending is a lot higher in the high school grades. And although this is a chart for the United States, I bet it would look very similar for the United Kingdom. Because these are kind of fundamental reasons why the middle school grades have lower instructional resources. All right, so now I've reached the sort of assessment stage. We want to take educational productivity seriously, right? That education production function, which Becker wrote down a long time ago, it's time for us to really start taking it seriously because we need to understand what it says to us about how to produce education efficiently in order to maximize economic growth and in order to have the sort of outcomes that we want to have coming out of our education sector, especially from the point of view of economics. For early adolescence, there's a combination of greater effects on cognitive skill from any sort of educational intervention I was able to test. The effects are longer lasting. And they're putting people apparently on different trajectories. Remember, that's quite important. It's not just that they're changing your skill or once. They really are sort of putting people on different trajectories that are then going to harden up, all right? And these adolescents have relatively low educational resources. Well, if you put all these things together, it inevitably suggests that the productivity of a marginal dollar or pound of educational resources is going to be unusually high for early adolescents. We're spending less on them, and yet when we do interventions on them, it matters more, and it lasts longer, and it's hard to go back and change because their trajectories harden up after early adolescence. It's harder to change people later on. You can still change them, but it is harder to do. All right. So just generally, I'm going to conclude that I think, first of all, we ought to be more attentive to neuroscience. When, as economists, I don't think we have to become neuroscientists. I guarantee I will never dissect anyone's brain because no. Okay, so, but we ought to be attentive to what it is that they're saying because essentially education is about neuroscience. I mean, it is about brain development. So should we ignore that science? No, obviously not. We should try to learn from it. But we should not take everything that it says, as evidence necessarily. But it should at least give us guidance as to the form of the education production function. And I think that's quite helpful. And then once we think about ability or cognitive skills as being really plastic rather than fixed or predetermined, then that should also make us think differently about the whole education production function. Because your ability at any given age is kind of a function of the history of interventions that you've had in the past. And when you had them may matter, not just whether you had them, okay? So that should all be sort of built into our thinking about educational productivity. On the plus side, or on the sort of positive or sunny side, I promised I would end this lecture with not such dire ideas as my lecture yesterday. On the sunny side, if ability or cognitive skill is plastic, and we know of some educational interventions that can affect it, and that we think that they're causal effects, then it's possible that we could really raise a lot of people's ability or cognitive skill, and then after that, we could all be on those higher trajectories. Remember, we're not going to force anybody onto lower trajectories. We can all have high cognitive skills and all have relatively high educational resources because that would be what would be optimal. Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop. And I am delighted to answer questions of any type, whether they're on today's lecture or yesterday's.